Hello and welcome to this session from PowerServer 2020 to PowerServer 2021, a shock or a shake. In the session you will learn opportunities of the new PowerServer 2021 from the perspective of the author, who has spent the last 15 years working with PowerServer Classic in roughly 100 of mobile and web projects. Topics covered include comparisons of performance tuning, architecture integration, PowerBuilder feature support, server components deployment and extensibility. You will learn why PowerServer 2021 offers a new approach to PowerBuilder developers, with its REST architecture that gives reliefs to major limitations of the old PowerServer versions, but also raises some questions on the future of existing migration. Let me bring up this disclaimer for a few seconds, as usual, for these contributions authored by volunteers in the Appeon community. Session agenda with the main aspects I want to discuss. Ideally, I will compare PowerServer 2020 and 2021 through a number of different perspectives, like I will discuss the difference in architecture, in platform, I will discuss the development environment, unsupported features, database support and connectivity, application startup, performance tuning, server integration, and security. Talk about me for a very little bit. I'm a PowerServer enthusiast, and I was more than eager to test PowerServer 2021 from the very beginning during the alpha and beta days. A bit concerned though because the big changes. I began with it from the early days in 2003 and have migrated to the web and mobile architecture countless of applications worldwide. I'm an Appeon MVP. I try to help on the community website and have been programming PowerBuilder since version 4.0. Lately, I've been involved in web front-end projects powered by REST API developed with SnapDevelop, and I've chosen Vue.js and Quasar as my favorite frameworks. I gave a long tutorial on this during last year Elevate. Other than that, I have advanced studies in machine learning and big data, and I like to stay up to date on these matters. So for those of you who have little or no experience at all with PowerServer, PowerServer extends the capabilities of PowerBuilder so that the PowerBuilder application can be deployed to n-tier architectures using only your PowerBuilder skills for business logic and UI. PowerServer 2020 is the last version of a series of releases across more than 15 years. This framework, let me call it traditional PowerServer or classic PowerServer, produces a true 3-tier web application or mobile application with Java or .NET-based backend and HTML UI frontend. A 3-tier application can be constructed quickly and easily, can be centered around the concept of data window using only your PowerServer skills. In this picture, you see the milestones of classic PowerServer in white arrows. From its origin around 2003 or so, in 2008 when .NET IIS support was introduced, in addition to the initial Java Enterprise Edition application server. In 2003, Appeon Mobile was born, and so you could build native iOS and Android applications. And last, let me remind 2017 when Appeon took over PowerBuilder from SAP, and Appeon Web and Mobile have been rebranded into PowerServer Web and Mobile as we know them today. However, with PowerServer 2021, the scenario has changed. Web and mobiles are replaced by an installable cloud app. Either way, PowerServer is the fastest way to convert PowerBuilder applications into bona fide and tier applications and convert PowerBuilder developers into highly productive cloud application developers. Let me tell you the difference in architecture. Architecture generally refers to the design level structure and the organization of an entire application system. So PowerServer 2020, the architecture is traditional web with JavaScript on the client side. When necessary, this JavaScript is wrapped into native code, like in the case of PowerServer mobile applications, and the backend is .NET or Java code running into an application server. PowerServer 2021 has an architecture moved to the cloud thanks to the deployment of installable cloud applications by means of native desktop Windows applications and with REST that enhance the concept of stateless communication separation of concern of client and server. Application dependencies are managed by dividing the application into layers that performs logical functions such as presentation, the business logic, and the data access. The JSON is the typical open data interchange format, but you can go beyond the schema. In fact, if your application has a more complex domain with the cloud architecture, you can also move to microservices deployment, where the application is composed of many small independent services. Each service implements a single business capability. That's why here also Docker and DevOps are mentioned. All this is PowerServer 2021 today. Now, platform generally refers to something like an operating system, a library, a programming language, a programming environment which you can build other things on. So in PowerServer 2020, as far as the client is concerned, the application that runs on the web environment can precisely replicate the traditional desktop user interface with HTML running in standard Windows web browser. Alternatively, it can run as an installable web application, which stay resident on the desktop and run without a web browser, streamlining accessibility. As simple as web deployment is mobile deployment too, with difference that for mobile, the app will benefit from a more mobile-friendly user interface, although it can fully encapsulate typical business logic from PowerBuilder consisting of data windows and most of the PowerScript. So there is support for iOS native and for Android native. Server, the application server can be either a .NET or J2E, which has offered over many years a variety of deployment platform, either in terms of operating systems, Windows servers, or Linux servers, and mostly in terms of application server, with JBoss, ES Server, WebLogic, and many more J2E rather than Microsoft IaaS for .NET architecture. With PowerServer 2021, client is necessarily Windows, where the installable cloud app will be downloaded and updated automatically. While server is cross-OS, this allows you to deploy the server API to all operating systems because they all support .NET Core Framework, but also Docker because you can publish the server-side code as a Docker image and run as a container with full support of Dockerfile and Container Orchestrator directly within Snap Develop IDE. And of course, you can publish the API to cloud platforms such as Microsoft Azure and Amazon AWS. In PowerBuilder IDE, you can configure and manage the entire life cycle of the PowerServer project. In 2020, you have this toolbar, the PowerServer Toolkit, which is a set of tools that enable the entire PowerBuilder to web or PowerBuilder to mobile process to take place within the PowerBuilder IDE. These tools are accessed via toolbar in the PowerBuilder IDE, which offers, among the other, Web and Mobile Application Config Wizard, configuration for local and remote database, multiple deployment support, which is nice because you can make a change to your application and define a profile to deploy the app to multiple servers at the same time, unsupported feature report, debugger for PowerServer web projects, so you can set breakpoints into the PowerBuilder code, run the web app that of course will execute JavaScript code on the client, and have the debugger with the original PowerBuilder line when the breakpoint is reached. And of course, package the application for distribution to Windows client, Android device, or iOS device. PowerServer 2021, similarly, there is not a toolbar, but a multi-tab window where to define cloud project properties, especially generation of the installable cloud app frontend, as well as generation of the server API backend and the database connection pool. So the cloud project, also local and remote database configuration. Having a local database connection is necessary for SQL validation and generation. To date, all individual deployment is supported, meaning each target server needs its own PowerServer project. Unsupported feature log. You may want to follow my PowerServer 2021 debugging session for an in-depth description. External HTTP proxy debugging tools that will make your life easier when it comes to understanding HTTP request and response between the installable Cloud App frontend and the API backend. Client debugger will be available probably in PowerServer 2022. And then you can deploy your server API to actual servers via web deploy or to Docker Engine in order to generate Docker images and run containers. Unsupported features are PowerServer syntax or PowerBuilder objects that won't work in the target PowerServer architecture. And in traditional PowerServer until version 2020, the concept of unsupported feature has been always taken with proper attention because given the conversion from PowerScript to JavaScript, there is a proper documentation stating what will be working and what will not. But of course, this gap has increased in the last couple of years that have seen a large set of new objects and control introduced in PowerBuilder and PowerServer not catching up because its end of life was closer and closer. To date, for example, a PowerServer 2020 project will not support UI themes, which makes your front-end better looking, or the ribbon bar, which modernizes a lot navigation system and menu options available to users, or the new Chromium-based PowerBuilder web browser object that allows you, for example, to easily preview PDF files or use interactive charting and visualization JavaScript library such as eChart, so you can present powerful graphs, or the compressor objects to zip and unzip data, rather than .NET Loader to open the client side of your applications to .NET libraries. Besides historical unsupported feature like class definition if you want to detect a function of an object at runtime, or data window of table blob, or shared objects function, or system objects like error or exceptions, and many more. But also data window functions and events, among the others, the very useful reselect row and retrieve row. So through thing is unsupported feature analysis and workaround has often represented a challenging step in PowerServer migration projects due to PowerScript to JavaScript conversion, and that's why you have extensive developers documentation guide for PowerServer Web at this link, or and for PowerServer Mobile at this link, which teach you the workarounds and all the bells and whistles you must learn to address this phase of your migration without losing too many features. But as I said, today the gap has become considerable and will not be filled because PowerServer 2020 architecture will be phased out in the coming future. On the other hand, PowerServer 2021 generates 100% PowerBuilder clients, and therefore supported features are close to 100%. You may have a few unsupported features or objects like the mobile link and also the data window, retrieve row and reselect row method and events, although they will be most likely supported in a future version of PowerServer. And you can have a look at the unsupported feature guide for PowerServer 2021 at this link, which is definitely a shorter list than PowerServer 2020. So read it in order to understand the list of unsupported features that can be detected by the deployment tool and provides possible workaround. Database, let's talk about database. In PowerServer 2020, there is an extensive support for all major database via ODBC, native drivers, and also JDBC, since you can have a PowerServer running on a variety of J2E servers. You can map PowerBuilder transaction objects to the proper data source in two ways: static mapping, meaning at deployment time, you say what data source binds to what transactions, or dynamic, meaning this binding happens at runtime in the code using the dbparm property of the transaction object. This way, you have full control of connect and disconnect data source at any time during your PowerServer application lifecycle. Since PowerServer produces three tiers applications, connection pooling represents the way database requests are handled. PowerServer connection pooling means that connections are used rather than created each time a connection is requested. And to facilitate connection reuse, a memory cache of database connections called, in fact, connection pool is maintained by a connection pooling module as a layer on top of any standard ODBC native or JDBC driver products. And PowerServer 2020 for .NET also offers you what is called dynamic connection, where you can set per user connections using transaction log ID and log path property in place of username and password specified in the data source. In PowerServer 2021, you have OLEDB and Ado.NET introduced for SQL Server. In general, connection to different databases happen through plugins that are downloaded automatically in Snap Develop from NuGet, the package manager for .NET. Static or dynamic data source mapping is also supported. Connection pooling is of course the way to reuse connections rather than create a new one every time the data provider needs to establish a connection to the underlying database. Dynamic connection is possible with installable cloud app that can connect to the database based on the user credentials provided at runtime. PowerServer 2021 also offers a solution to long-lived connections, where, for example, the application first executes an SQL to set the session context variables or create a temporary table, and then another SQL reads them back. With connection pooling, the two SQLs work in different connections, so the result is wrong because every time after SQL execution the connection is closed. But with PowerServer 2021 you can get the session ID from the installable cloud app, and use this session ID to set a cache group in the PowerBuilder transaction object dbparm. And then this cache group is used in the app config extensions of the server API. .NET Core in fact lets you create a singleton service that is a single instance of the service when it is first requested and reuses the same instance in all the places where the service is needed. So long-lived connections are possible in 2021 while they become difficult to achieve in 2020 because the only way was to use helper class extensions that are only supported by few application server and database. As far as the startup of the application is concerned, PowerServer 2020 requires to download and install the cross-browser plugin for Edge, Chrome, and Firefox. And this step doesn't require any admin rights, so a regular user can typically start a web app automatically. A PowerServer 2020 web app can also run as so-called installable web app. It doesn't require a web browser because it runs as a desktop app, although the code executed is still JavaScript, and this is the purpose of the background installable web app runner process. If you're using a PowerServer app from your Android or iOS device, Appeon Workspace AWS is a native app that can launch the actual PowerServer application. PowerServer 2021 introduces the App Cloud Launcher. When you access the deployed application via its URL, the Cloud App Launcher is downloaded, and then in turn it downloads in the installable Cloud App and starts it. As for the cross-browser, this step doesn't require any admin rights, so the regular user can typically start an ICA and installable Cloud App without intervention of an administrator. The launcher can also be started with background service, which this is, for example, an option that helps you running multiple sessions on a Citrix environment, which is instead not possible with PowerServer 2020 because cross-browser and IWA are not designed for that. A nice feature in PowerServer 2021 is the integrated signing support. For example, you can use Microsoft Sign tool or an external script to sign digitally the ICA executable, which helps because antivirus and app locker apply always more and more restrictions when it comes to running application. Next is performance tuning. Frequent complaint about a user after migrating a PowerBuilder application with PowerServer 2020 is the PowerServer app is slow, and this has two reasons. First, compiled code when running PowerBuilder application versus interpreted code when running PowerServer application, with PowerScript converted into JavaScript. And affected by this lower performance are dynamic SQL constructions, data caching, window resize, rather than menu walkthrough, because JavaScript is single-threaded interpreted language and recursive code or intensive usage of memory structures leads to poor performance. Second reason, and most important because typically here it comes how legacy PowerBuilder applications are written, the multiple server calls. As a background knowledge, any code that results in an HTTP request when it is executed multiple times sequentially has the potential to create network chatter. Examples are data access like embedded SQL, data window, data store functions, or uh, calls to web service, etc., etc. And PowerServer 2020 provides language extension called labels to group server calls like the bulk requests, so multiple data window retrieve, multiple or sequential embedded SQL, and bulk updates. And PowerServer 2020 comes also with data window caching support to buffer static data and speed up runtime execution, and also data window dynamic data window SQL syntax caching, which helps to speed up performance without the need to rewrite the code, but simply working at PowerServer 2020 configuration level. PowerServer 2021 doesn't need any tuning on the client side because the ICIA, the installable cloud app frontend, is 100% PowerBuilder native code. So let's focus on the server side. Refactoring of long, heavy scripts may be needed to limit the amount of web API requests and improve performance. This, of course, depends on how the original application is written and subsequent partitioning into 3-tier. In previous slide related to database connection, I introduced the fact that PowerServer 2021 can support long-lived connection. Just be aware they will not rely on connection pooling, so they may affect the performance of the application, as it always have to establish a new connection when the user starts the application. So if applicable, you must separate your code logic so that the code that requires long-lived connection goes with one transaction object, and the code that doesn't need long-lived connection goes with other transaction objects, where the connection pooling instead will be used, thus making full use of the web architecture and future enhancement. Additionally, keep in mind that Appeon is working on supporting HTTP2 and asynchronous programming in future PowerServer release. Server integration is the ability of PowerServer to give you any means to interact with external component. So PowerServer 2020 exposes a number of proprietary API to get, for example, the client ID, the client IP address, the client type, cache dir, etc., etc. It provides its own proxy implementation for SOAP Web Service, which is called Appeon Web Service Component. You can also use the more up-to-date HTTP client objects, but the execution will be client-side. Another object called Appeon.NET Component allows PowerServer 2020 to load .NET assembly so you can use them in your deployed application. Similarly, you have a proxy objects to interact with server Java beans in J2E application server. And I would mention a handy built-in file service feature that allows your PowerServer application to upload and download easily files to and from a selected server directory. PowerServer 2021 instead comes with a set of OpenAPI via REST call, so you can retrieve information about sessions, connection, etc. through a number of public controllers. Just look up in the documentation. It offers integration with authentication standards such as JSON Web Token or OpenAuth 2.0 protocol. You can extend controllers to add your own business logic in C#. For example, you can use the C# HTTP client class to access REST or SOAP services from the server side. PowerServer offers health check report for SQL execution performance to network connection failures and also Log4net login framework for login purposes. You have access to runtime PowerServer core, which provides data access for installable cloud application. For example, you can configure here the logic to implement long-lived connection explained above. Or you can add custom REST API. Point is you have access to C# source code implementing the server API, and therefore there is plenty of room for custom code, while with PowerServer 2020, the core server components were rather a black box. Security. PowerServer 2020 has a rigid implementation, typically based on traditional user and password schemas. Otherwise, you can access LDAP service or the built-in Appeon security with configurable groups and users. PowerBuilder HTTP client object extends the cards you can play because you can call REST authentication services, although keep in mind it will be logic running on the client side, which is maybe not what you want. That's why in PowerServer 2021, with its open design, you can definitely implement a larger variety of authentication schemas. You can call PowerServer Open API in PowerBuilder login code and enable authentication in C# startup file of the generated server API. You can use JSON authentication token. In general, you can replace the default C# authentication code with your own, for example, OpenOut 2.0. And let me mention Visual Guard, since it is definitely easier to use it in PowerServer 2021 project because you can use Visual Guard client modules or REST API services. Let's recap then. What is my feeling for PowerServer 2021? Whether it has been a shock after many years of migration projects with traditional Power servers, or a shake with new opportunities. The true thing is, PowerServer 2020 is still a very valuable product, offering a plug-and-play solution for migrating your legacy application or to web or mobile architectures, but you wouldn't start a brand new development project with this PowerServer. Not because it won't make it. The speed at which you would be able to deliver a data window-centric application is still unbeatable, and also you would skip the unsupported feature phase because a new project is meant to use only supported features by design, but because you feel the technology under the hood is aging and has a limited extensibility. Plus, as a developer, you must accept Appion's strategy to change PowerServer framework towards installable cloud app, and you must cope with this. Installable cloud app launcher, at a first glance, can turn your nose up like the multi-browser plugin when it comes to download and install additional client components. But it is more powerful because it supports multi-user. Personally, I had life easier during this COVID time in overcoming resistance from security teams regarding the client modules to whitelist, because especially in large companies, the business model has moved towards remote work, where Citrix is often the leading virtualization and PC access technology. And with Cloud App Launcher, Cloud App Launcher will make your ICA working in a multi-user virtualized environment, unlike the multi-browser plugin. PowerBuilder language feature support is about 100%, which is of course a big plus because you don't want to be overwhelmed by workarounds to include in a PowerServer web application a better looking UI or more flexible security policies. Conversion effort is limited and usually predictable in PS 2021, while in PS 2020 it can just be a work can just work out of the box, or it can take months depending on how the original PowerBuilder application has been designed. PowerServer framework has now an open REST JSON architecture in place of a black box design. We have discussed how security model is now flexible and open to emerging standards rather than rigid and limited to few schemas. Last point is what you must give up at the moment to join the boat. No mobile applications that you can fully build from PowerBuilder. But I trust Appeon won't give up on mobile market and will add support for the leading UI framework combined with server API that you can now build in PowerServer 2021 and future versions. Keep in touch with Appeon. The community portal is the place to be, where you can find discussions, technical articles, video, and free online tutorials. Of course, follow the social networks. Thank you very much for your attention. I will be happy to answer your questions in the next 10 minutes that are dedicated for chatting about the session.